First of all, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and coming over. So, we would like for you to introduce yourself. So, most of our audience won't know you. So, please.
Sure. So my name is Lance Bush. I am a philosopher and a psychologist. I have a PhD in psychology from Cornell and a master's in philosophy from Tufts. I do interdisciplinary research at the intersection of philosophy and psychology, primarily focused on moral psychology, the psychology of metaethics, and I have a big emphasis on the methods used to explore how experimental philosophers conduct their research. So a lot of that is centered on basically when we want to ask people that don't have academic training in philosophy questions in order to try to better understand their philosophical views. I focus a lot on the methods used to conduct that research. And that's something that's developed over the course of my dissertation as I became increasingly concerned that there were really, really serious methodological challenges in, you could say, translating or communicating philosophical concepts, like technical concepts, to people that lack the technical background to interpret them using the terminology and the conceptual schemes of academic philosophers. So yeah, that's my background. I guess, so that's my academic background, but I should also say I have a YouTube channel and a blog, and I just started on TikTok, and I go by Lance Independent in all of those places. And there I talk a lot about metaethics, moral realism, and anti-realism. And I talk a little bit about psychology and other topics as well.
Yeah, basically, the YouTube is how I actually came to know you, and the reason why we invite you over. So, the main topic of the discussion is philosophical intuition. What is a philosophical intuition?
So it's a good question because the question of what a philosophical intuition is itself a philosophical question. And unfortunately and regrettably, I don't think that there's any sort of definitive answer to what a philosophical intuition is. So I could say a few things about the sorts of things that people would consider philosophical intuitions. I should note, though, that there is some metaphilosophical literature on the nature of intuitions, like what they are, philosophically speaking, psychologically speaking, and perhaps most importantly, epistemologically speaking, like what sort of evidential role they play in philosophy. And there's even dispute. There's people like Capellan who argue that philosophers, despite appearances, don't actually use intuitions, at least historically, at least not as much as people think that they do. And that it really is a kind of this use of the term intuition is a kind of verbal eccentricity of the field, and it doesn't really capture or describe any particular type of thing, anything in particular. So speaking for myself, I do think philosophers use, you could say, quote unquote, intuitions. I just think that it's a very, very heterogeneous category that is extremely ill-defined. Now, that's all a roundabout way of not really giving an answer. So very roughly, philosophical intuitions, we can say a few things about what they are and what they're not within boundaries. They are not the colloquial sort of everyday sense of intuition that many people are familiar with. Like the everyday use of the term would be a kind of almost like ineffable sense, like you just have a sense that something will happen or something is true. And there's often something almost paranormal or parapsychological about that use of intuition, although it doesn't have to be. It could be that you're picking up unconsciously on things in your environment. But generally, that everyday use of intuition is this sort of difficult to articulate sense that something is the case or something will happen. That's not what philosophers are talking about when they talk about intuition. It's not that colloquial use. What they are typically talking about is a kind of non-inferential disposition or tendency to consider something to be true or to be the case, or it's an inclination to believe something that isn't the result of some sort of rational or sequential process of reasoning. It's not like reasoning through a syllogism or mathematics or making a visual observation and then following some procedure like, hey, this object, I'm looking at it, is larger than that object. Making that sort of judgment, that's not an intuition. It's a visual observation and inference. So philosophical intuitions, very roughly, are sort of non-inferential you could say disposition to believe a proposition. So, for instance, you may find that you have the intuition that certain sorts of moral claims are true, and perhaps true in a stance independent way. Or you may have the intuition that certain sorts of metaphysical claims or epistemological claims, again, are true. And in these cases, you're not inferring this because you're considering principle A and principle B, and it's a sort of natural inference to make. Given these principles, this propositional claim is true. It's not like that. It's more direct. It's more that you just find yourself disposed to believe something is true. You might even say, in some respects, and this is why it gets complicated, because there are different positions on what intuitions are. Some people, and you could check, like, for instance, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on intuition. Some people will simply say, yeah, intuitions are beliefs. Some people will say that they are dispositions to believe that don't necessarily entail belief. And some people, and maybe this would be the best way to characterize them, although I don't have a definitive stance on this. Some people might appeal to them having a distinct type of phenomenology. In other words, there's a distinct way they present themselves to us experientially. And it's specifically this sort of, you could say it's a kind of intellectual seeming. This is the sort of terminology I believe Mike Humer uses. And an intellectual seeming can be distinguished from a sort of perceptual seeming. So I can perceive the color red or hear a bird singing. Those are certain kinds of seemings that have a sort of perceptual quality to them, where they seem to be experienced in terms of a particular type of sensorial state, sound, sight, taste, that sort of thing. So the idea here is to draw on a sort of analogy to these sensorial seemings and say certain sorts of intellectual considerations present themselves to us by way of our sort of direct subjective experience. Phenomenologically, we just experience certain intellectual considerations as true. So that, I think, might be one of the maybe the least controversial or one of the most straightforward ways of presenting what a philosophical intuition is. But any one of these characterizations of intuitions would be contested in the philosophical literature. Now, my own view is that all of these uses they're not illegitimate. I don't think that there's any sort of fact of the matter about what an intuition is or isn't. Rather, I see people simply using the term to refer to a variety of different psychological states. So my own take on what's going on here is that I think that philosophers are operating largely outside the ambit of contemporary cognitive science and the best available evidence in psychology, and thus they are really without the empirical resources to accurately and precisely characterize the types of psychological states that are involved in, quote unquote, intuition. And were they to do so, I think that we would find that the notion of a philosophical intuition doesn't refer to any distinctive type of psychological state, and rather it is continuous with the type, like the things that we tend to be referring to when we invoke the notion of a philosophical intuition are continuous with and subsumed by the types of psychological states that are already characterized or will be characterized, again, by our best available cognitive psychology. So basically, I don't think there is any such distinctive thing as a philosophical intuition. I think that what philosophers are talking about are a variety of different types of psychological states. They have different causal mechanisms, different genealogies, different functions, and different evidential statuses. And so I think it would be very challenging to say anything universal about philosophical intuitions, like we should rely on them or we shouldn't rely on them. So because part of the reason for that is that some of the things that, when a philosopher says, I have an intuition, that could be the result of a reliable and sort of, you could say, epistemically virtuous cognitive process, and some other appeal to an intuition. There's some other case where a philosopher says, I have an intuition, and it's not the result of a reliable process. And the only way for us to really know is to start mapping the expressions, judgments, and sorts of things philosophers are doing when they appeal to intuitions onto the appropriate psychological states to which they happen to be employing them. That work really hasn't been done. So at present, when philosophers draw on their intuitions, I think we're just not in a position to know whether the invocation of an intuition in any particular case is the result of any particularly reliable system. We don't even know what these systems are. So this is effectively unexplored territory. And as a final point about that, I would just say generally, philosophers have a bad habit of engaging in armchair psychology without doing the appropriate empirical work to really support what they're saying. So basically, the short answer I would say is that philosophical intuition is a kind of armchair psychological term of art philosophers invented. It has not been adequately integrated into our best understanding of psychology, even though, from my perspective, they're invoking psychological claims. And that makes it kind of outside the bounds of our capacity to really clearly and definitively evaluate what philosophers are talking about. And I think that we need to do the appropriate empirical research to really find out.
I also want to ask about a few characteristics, like whether the philosophical intuition people are born with it or we acquire them via perception or by our experience. Then is it cultural or is it universal?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, the first thing to say about this sort of thing is that, as you're going to hear this from me a lot, it's an empirical question. So the first thing I would say is that I find it very unlikely that all intuitions would share the same sort of etiology, that they're all going to have their sort of same foundation, because it's not necessarily the case that, the human brain is a complex apparatus. Different features of the way that our brain operates were subject to different sorts of selective pressures. And so it's not just one big system that was subject to exactly a single set of selective pressures. And so different systems could have different evolutionary histories. So as a result, that makes it very challenging to say intuitions have this particular evolutionary history. It could be some intuitions are the result of a process that had one evolutionary history and some are the result of another. And again, it's an empirical question. And since we haven't really done, at least not rigorously and definitively, the type of empirical research to really know, like when a philosopher says, hey, I'm having an intuition about this, about consciousness or an issue in philosophy of mind or about morality, what psychological systems are involved, it's really hard to know, which system it's the result of. However, I still think some general things can be said about this. The first is that sort of nature-nurture dichotomy, that's not really the way I think it's not really the way a lot of psychologists would think of it, as there being a sort of trade-off, but I see the two as dynamically interrelated in a way that's very hard to separate. That doesn't mean that there aren't certain sorts of characteristics that are a lot more rooted in our physiology and others that are a lot more rooted in culture. Sometimes when people say, hey, the nature-nurture dichotomy is false, they use it as a sort of as a way of bypassing or dismissing reasonable questions about the degree of the degree to which something is subject to evolution or culture. For instance, I think it would be pretty silly to say that human kidney function or liver function isn't largely a product of biology and not a product of culture. Now, I wouldn't say that there aren't cultural factors that influence the functions of our physiology. For instance, there could be some cultures where they're more likely to drink milk or they're more likely to drink alcohol, and people from those cultures over a period of time may develop adaptations for metabolizing things. And then you would get this culture biology feedback. So I'm a big fan of gene culture coevolutionary approaches, where changes to culture change the selective pressures from a biological perspective, which in turn change people's biology. Those changes in biology can then feed back into influencing changes in culture in a sort of a dynamic interplay where they mutually influence one another. All of that being said, I suspect that that culture plays a very, very substantial role in shaping many of the philosophical intuitions that philosophers have, especially because I'm operating under the presumption that we're largely talking about contemporary analytic philosophy. And contemporary analytic philosophy, the type of philosophy I was trained in and that I work in, is an almost exclusively Anglophone phenomena. It arose largely in the United States and the UK. Almost all of it is done in English, written in English, conferences are in English. Even if you go other places in the world, people are still, it's English, English, English all the way. And as a result of that, and I should add, it's not just that the people participating in the discipline themselves tend to come from Anglophone backgrounds. They're also trained on an educational corpus that is itself predominantly English or at least Western European. So German and French stuff would be common as well. So the history of philosophy itself is, analytic philosophy in particular, is deeply shaped by a distinctive cultural history, and the philosophers engaged in the discipline are inducted in to that canon. They read that corpus, and that influences how they think and see the world. I would find it absolutely remarkable if that didn't have a substantial influence on their judgments and their intuitions. There is an ongoing debate, and it's a pretty big one, between some of the big names in experimental philosophy about precisely the degree of cultural variation in philosophical intuitions among the general public. And this is a dispute largely between Mashry and colleagues and Nob and colleagues, with Mashry largely arguing that we have substantial evidence of significant cross-cultural variation in intuitions, and Nob arguing that there's actually substantial convergence in cross-cultural intuitions. I think it would come as no surprise that I am generally far more sympathetic to Mashry's perspective on the matter. And having looked at the overall set of studies that they appeal to, I do think Mashry has, at least at present, and from what I saw from the last time I had a look at that, a stronger case that there is significant cross-cultural variation in philosophical intuitions. So I think that provides that, and that's a sort of analysis of the overall body of literature. That, I think, provides more direct empirical evidence that culture does influence people's philosophical intuitions. There is more generally quite a lot of evidence that people from particular populations that happen to be the ones where most analytic philosophy is done, these are weird populations. This is an acronym devised by Henrik Heine and Noren Zion in the paper, The Weirdest People in the World. That paper, so WEIRD is an acronym that stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. That paper documents a substantial and diverse array of cross-cultural research showing that people from weird populations, which includes, like, analytic philosophy is a weird phenomenon. Anyway, this research shows that people from those populations, it's not just that they are psychologically different from people in other parts of the world. They actually happen to be, across a range of measurable dimensions, the most idiosyncratic population with respect to those dimensions. In other words, if you took some measure, and it could be scored from like 1 to 10, and you look at most of the world, it's like 6, 7, 7, 8, and then the United States would be a 1. And then if you look at some other measure, it could be 3, 4, 3, 5, and then the United States will be a 9 or a 10. So, and I say the United States because that's a sort of prototypical weird population. So we have a lot of empirical evidence that would suggest that human psychology more generally is highly variable across cultures, and that in particular, when it comes to philosophy, that philosophical intuitions vary. So there's so much more to say about that. It's such an interesting topic, but I would say culture plays a very, very, very big role here, and it's an ongoing question how big of a role it plays.
Next, I want to ask about the epistemic status of philosophical intuition. You kind of touched this when attempting the answer for philosophical intuition. So I just want to ask, like, how much weight should we give to philosophical intuitions? Suppose a person they make an argument based on a premise that solely depend on a philosophical intuition. Should we actually believe in the conclusion?
Yeah, my initial reaction is to say not much. I don't put a whole lot of stock in intuition. I tend to take an empiricist and pragmatist approach to philosophy more broadly. And when it comes to intuitions, an intuition may, and I say may and I mean it, be a reasonable sort of starting point, and then one adjusts away from that initial starting point. And that, I think, is totally fine. If intuitions are treated as a kind of prior, or they're treated as a kind of tiny bump, evidential bump in favor of a view, that can easily be overturned by arguments, considerations, and evidence to the contrary, then it's fine to give them that tiny tidbit of evidential status. The problem is that the way that philosophers and non-philosophers as well appeal to intuitions in practice is what I call an epistemic blank check. They often treat their intuitions as having arbitrary or potentially unlimited evidential weight to override any arguments or evidence to the contrary. And you will see a kind of sloganized form of this from moral realists who will say any argument against moral realism would appeal to premises that are less plausible than the truth of moral realism. Now, that may or may not be something that is defensible, but the point just is that if someone is going around convinced of that from the outset, then they may be treating their intuitions not simply as having some evidential weight, but as always being able to override any arguments, evidence, or considerations to the contrary. What I worry about is that absent some justification of the appeal to intuitions that goes beyond something like Hume's phenomenal conservatism, that doesn't, you could say, precisify like the degree of evidential weight that they have in relation to other forms of evidence, it remains obscure what evidential status they ought to have. So personally, I think we should start by questioning the relation between appeals to intuition and other sorts of considerations, because you do see quite a lot a kind of exchange where a philosopher will say, I have an intuition that P. And someone will respond, okay, here's some arguments to the contrary. These serve as defeaters. And that philosopher will say, no, my intuition is stronger than that evidence. Well, how are they determining that? Is if the entire contents of that appraisal happens privately. So they appeal to their subjective experience, right? So you present arguments and evidence to them, and they say, okay, well, I consider that to be 10 points of evidence against my view. Now I privately evaluate phenomenologically my intuition, and it's 15 points in favor of my view. I win. I'm justified in my view. One of the problems is that this turns the appraisal of evidence into a private and subjective matter. Now, perhaps it is that way. I want to be a good Bayesian, but then the appraisal of evidence is subject to standards that are private and inaccessible to other people. And that immediately raises some very serious red flags for me. You could imagine a kind of like a court of law where we're trying to determine if someone is guilty of committing a crime. We present DNA evidence, their fingerprints, a written confession from the person. We find the murder weapon in their house. And then the jury says, well, but I have a really strong intuition that they didn't do the crime. That's going to start to look really fishy. And it's starting to look, in cases like that, like a person is simply intransigent or stubborn, or they're not. It's not epistemically virtuous. It appears to me that way from the outside, and I think it would appear to most of us that way. But if we can't consult external standards that we mutually agree on to adjudicate disputes about the evidential status of intuitions, people can always fall back on just saying, well, I am justified because of the strength of my intuition. Now, coupled with human psychological biases like motivated reasoning and the simple, maybe it's not a bias, but the simple fact that a person would be deeply embarrassed if they turned out to be wrong, people have a strong motivation to not give up their beliefs. And I think that this appeal to intuitions provides a rather poor excuse for people to be stubborn and intransigent in the face of arguments against their views. So, it's tough. I think philosophers yet again need to turn to psychology and start looking at what's going on here with intuitions to try to settle the matter.
When you say look at psychology, you mean study a lot of subject, like what's the intuition or anything like that?
What I mean is that we basically need a psychology of philosophy. We need to understand psychologically what's going on when philosophers make the sorts of arguments that they make. More generally, I would say, and that would be a kind of metaphilosophical approach, which is understanding how psychologists think and reason. But the other thing that we really need is to better integrate epistemology and psychology in order to understand how human reasoning works in general. We really need to understand at a behavioral level, at a neurophysiological level, cognitively speaking, how human judgment and reasoning works, and integrate that with our understanding of how philosophers engage in the practices that they're engaged in. For instance, what if we found, I don't know what this would look like, but what if we found that philosophers that say, I have a really, really strong intuition in favor of this view, so evidence to the contrary is it's not sufficient. What if we find, for instance, that they have that they're just being incorrigible, like certain features of their motivational system that would prompt them to reflect on or reconsider their position, that they are somehow interfered with by some system that, for instance, appears to function in other cases to preserve embarrassment or protect one from a feeling of shame or something like that. Well, it's going to start to look a whole lot like they are relying on a psychological system that is about preserving their reputation. So what we need is a better understanding of the psychological processes going on when philosophers reason and render judgments. And it's possible, just to simplify it, that we would discover that in at least some cases, the psychological mechanisms involved in certain sorts of philosophical judgments or intuitions are the result of psychological processes that we would not, on reflection, endorse as reliable or truth tracking systems. And if that's the case, I don't think I would need to convince philosophers to stop relying on intuitions in that case. I think they would stop relying on them in that case. In other words, I don't have to appeal to some overarching, objectively correct standard of epistemology to say, hey, wouldn't you agree that if your judgment in this case is the result of a psychological system, the primary function of which is to help you promote your reputation or avoid shame and embarrassment, not to track truth, that maybe we should rely on that system in this particular case? Maybe we should seek evidence elsewhere. I don't think philosophers, if they were genuinely convinced of that, would be like, no. I think they would go, okay, yeah, maybe we need to not rely on it in that case. Now, that's not to say I think that that's what's going to happen. I think that we'll find that the matter is messy and complicated, and some of our judgments we would trust on once we understand the relevant psychology, and some of them we wouldn't. And that, I think, would change the overall philosophical landscape once we have that understanding. But until we do, philosophers are really flying by the seat of their pants. I think that they are they're basically operating using a set of tools, and they don't understand how the tools work. And I find that very bizarre. I think philosophy, the way that it functions metaphilosophically, I guess you could say methodologically, sits on top of our understanding of human psychology. I mean, we're using a tool, the human brain, to do philosophy, and yet philosophers seem to me, in many cases, I mean, obviously there's philosophers of mind and people that work on this, but even there, often the issue is consciousness or something like that, personal identity. It's not, how does the mind relate to doing philosophy itself? And you would think of all fields, philosophy would love that sort of meta question. And yet, not many philosophers work on it. But until we have that understanding, philosophers are basically operating using the tool, and they don't really know how the tool works. And I find that really weird. In almost any other field, physicists are not going to use equipment for detecting, the motion of a particle or mass or something like that without calibrating and making sure that it's really, really precise and reliable. And they test that over and over and over to make sure that there's that precision there. People, chefs test their equipment. They make sure that their ovens work and their stoves work. People in everyday practices where there are practical consequences have to make sure that their stuff works, or they're going to run into problems. Philosophers they don't have those checks and balances. If a philosopher reasons badly, a bridge is not going to collapse. A house is not going to set on fire. Your food isn't going to be disgusting. So they haven't had the stakes where they've had to, really actually understand how their tools work. So that's what I would say. Philosophers need to understand how their tools work, and they don't. And unless and until they do, there's just a bunch of big question marks about how philosophy works, and a much scarier question whether it works.
Okay, so I kind of asked the same question to Mike Humor, that how can we trust our own intuition, whether it's right or wrong. So the answer he gave is just rely on other intuition, like using intuition to check on the intuition. So what will your response be to that approach?
I would have to know more about how that's supposed to work. I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that. So humor appeals to phenomenal conservatism, and the way humor characterizes intuitions, my understanding is that basically at some point we're going to have to appeal to how things seem or what our intuitions about things are, and everything is going to follow from that. That doesn't strike me as obviously wrong. So I don't have a huge problem. Basically, if you want to say, hey, this particular thing that seems a certain way, if I'm going to be skeptical about it seeming that way, at some point in that process, what else am I going to appeal to other than some contrary seeming? If that's what humor is getting at, I don't see anything wrong with that. I really don't. Which it's interesting then, in light of that, how in spite of the fact that we seem to start from the same place, we seem to end up in very different places. Although I'm still not convinced we start in the same place. But yeah, that doesn't strike me as necessarily a problem. My concern is not someone saying, hey, I rely on or I use intuitions. My concern is specifically how they use them. There's a big difference between having an intuition that something is true, and then you engage with the world and you update and revise your position from that starting point, and intuitions that become a kind of dogma or they become entrenched. And no matter what you experience in the world, the intuition seems to be impervious to those changes and considerations. And I really worry that what's really going on is that intuition, philosophical intuition in practice, is a type of learned psychological tool that basically only philosophers employ, or at least primarily philosophers, and then other people are influenced by them.
So my next question is whose intuition matters? Like there are philosophical experts, but they disagree on various things. Then we have non-experts, the common people. Then we also have children who are less influenced by culture. So whose intuitions we must relay mostly?
I think that the different intuitions are going to matter for different questions. If the question is about what the common sense or everyday view is, then it's best to rely on non-specialists, and that would include both adults and children. But it's going to depend on the question. If you want to know if you want a judgment about the deployment of a particular term or concept in a particular language, it might make the most sense to rely on adult non-philosopher populations, because those are going to be the people that both have had the time, experience, and enculturation to be competent native users of that term or concept in that particular linguistic community, without the potentially biasing or corrupting influence of training in philosophy. So you would want adults in that case. If you want to know about certain potentially universal or evolved dispositions to produce certain sorts of judgments, then yeah, cross-cultural research on children would make the most sense to have a look at. What you would want to do is gather cross-cultural data and cross-reference it and see, because the thing is, even if you reliably find in a given population different judgments among children and among adults, that does not guarantee that the adult judgments are themselves not the result of some evolutionary process. The reason for that is that simply because something occurs in an adult population but not among children within that same society, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the result of enculturation. Some processes are the result of development in psychology that occurs over the lifespan. So there is developmental psychological research showing that children differ from adults in various sorts of judgments, like object permanence and that sort of thing. And that's a sort of naturally recurring thing that would occur in presumably different populations around the world, maybe at different speeds and or at different rates, or there might be qualitative variations in those processes. But the point would just be that what we would want is not an isolated understanding of how children render judgments or adults render judgments, but the developmental trajectory by which children, you could say, start to think like adults in any given population, so that you could determine, well, is that change from thinking like children to thinking like an adults? To what extent is there variation across cultures that you could point to and say, okay, this factor or this element or this aspect of those judgments is the result of enculturation, and which are the result of developmental processes that would occur across populations? So, as like with so many of my other answers, I think that the answers here are, it's not going to be like, study how children think, study how adults think. It's study everybody, and it's really going to matter what kind of question you're asking. If instead you're asking about what people would judge on reflection, then you might want to get the judgments of philosophers. But I think that you're going to run into a significant problem there. A lot of philosophers might think that human beings or agents or rational agents in general or whatever possess the intellectual faculties such that they would reliably converge on the same judgments on reflection. In other words, there's a kind of culture transcendent tendency for rational beings to share certain sorts of judgments and intuitions on reflection that is not mediated by or a product of culture. The problem is that I think a lot of philosophers reach that conclusion while almost exclusively operating within a particular culture. So a lot of analytic philosophers might think that their judgments in metaphysics or ethics or aesthetics really are these sort of culture transcendent judgments. And I just don't think that they're in a position to know that that's the case. So they might say, yeah, what we really want are the philosophical judgments or intuitions of people with the appropriate degree of expertise or training. The problem is that it's very hard to work out in practice whether a person has expertise in some sort of skill or ability that does transcend culture and they're not simply expressing a cultural bias. I don't know how to disentangle those questions. And I would say this is perhaps pessimistic, but I nevertheless think it's true that analytic philosophers have done virtually nothing to show that the convergence, what little there is within analytic philosophy, is the result of legitimate expertise. I just don't think that they've shown that they're actually experts at, you could say, being correct about philosophical issues, at least not within very circumscribed limits. That certainly doesn't allow them to make pronouncements about broad questions in metaphysics or ethics or epistemology.
You distinguished like analytical philosophers that they don't investigate too much on the philosophical intuition. Then you also said this is a field called experimental philosophy, right? So can you just differentiate what is experimental philosophy? How is it different from good or analytical philosophy?
Sure. So experimental philosophy, I actually see it as a movement that arose within analytic philosophy. So I see it as part of it, but yeah, it is different from, you could say, like classical or traditional analytic philosophy. Experimental philosophy is a relatively recent movement that arose in the early 2000s that basically employs the tools of the social sciences, primarily psychology, although you could employ any empirical sciences in principle, to explore how people without significant training in philosophy think or reason or judge or what their intuitions are about traditionally philosophical topics. So a lot of it is going to cover questions about how people think about how people that are not philosophers think about free will or knowledge and that sort of thing. Now, that's a sort of narrow definition. There's nothing about experimental philosophy that prohibits the people in the field from exploring how philosophers think about these issues. Really, for me, what I think distinguishes experimental philosophy is really a tendency to try to address or inform or think about traditionally philosophical questions or the psychological question of what people think about these questions using empirical tools. That's what I would say. It's the empirical study of how people think about philosophical issues.
Could you explain the methodology, like using an example? You could use like free will, how the experimental philosophy can answer the questions about free will, how they collect the data from ordinary people, or using the data, what sort of conclusion will they make? That sort of things.
Sure. So I'll give a couple examples. One of them would be, there's a lot of dispute among proponents of free will about whether free will is compatible with determinism or not. And so the two big camps are libertarian accounts of free will and compatibilist accounts of free will. Now, some philosophers that endorse free will think that free will is incompatible with the truth of determinism. That is, if determinism is true, then people do not have free will. Others think that even if determinism is true, we still would or could have free will. It's basically not an interference. That doesn't mean they think determinism necessarily is true. It just means if it is, we could still have free will. So you have that compatibilist view and you have that incompatibilist view. Now, the question would be, sometimes people will charge compatibilists. They'll say, hey, you're just changing the definition of free will. You're just trying to offer an account of something that's not what we understand free will to be. We understand free will to be something that is of such a kind that it is in fact incompatible with determinism. Now, what you could do is run a survey on people in your population to see, do they think free will is incompatible with determinism? And if most people don't, this might suggest that at the very least, the way that non-philosophers are disposed to think and talk about free will, they don't see it as incompatible with determinism. And then accusations directed at compatibilists that they're changing the definition or offering a revisionary account are just wrong, that they are not doing so. Now, so that's one role. Another role it could be used to do is to shift the burden of proof. So an example of that would be a lot of philosophers will say most people are moral realists, and this provides some prima facie justification for thinking moral realism is true. It's not a lot of justification, perhaps, but it's some. Now, if it turns out, and then that might be then leveraged to say that the burden of proof is on moral anti-realists to show that anti-realism is true because realism is the sort of received or default position. So that's a burden shifting move. So you have a couple things there. Philosophers will say that a particular position is revisionary or changing the subject, or they'll say that a particular position is not commonsensical, and so that counts against it. And that shifts the burden of proof onto proponents of that sort of non-commonsensical or counterintuitive position. So that's a couple of the moves philosophers will make where they themselves, the philosophers, are appealing to how ordinary people, non-philosophers, speak or think. So sometimes philosophers will say evidence from experimental philosophy on how non-philosophers think is philosophically irrelevant. Well, that's absurd in cases where the philosopher themselves is explicitly appealing to empirical claims about how non-philosophers think. Of course, whether or not those claims are true, empirically, well, whether they're true and whether we have empirical evidence for or against them, of course, that's relevant. So that those kinds of objections, I think, are silly. Sometimes some philosophers seem to think that philosophers doing experimental philosophy are saying, if a majority of non-philosophers think a particular philosophical position is true, then that philosophical position is true. And that's I mean, maybe some experimental philosophers did that, especially early on, but that's not really the role that it's playing in contemporary philosophy. Anyway, so let me describe how one of these studies would work. Here's something that you would do. Most psychological research is either going to be conducted with students at universities. So students in your classes, you would issue them a survey or participate in a study, sometimes for course credit, sometimes, maybe they're given some other sort of incentive to do so. The other thing that people use is online survey platforms like Amazon's Mechanical Turk or Prolific, where people are paid in order to fill out these surveys, and they do them online. So what you might do to test this compatibilism versus incompatibilism view is you have a survey. So a person gives the survey, it's stuff printed on a page or it's on the computer screen, and they do it on, online. And they'll be given a description. Hey, imagine there's a universe in which if you know all the physical facts, you can predict all future physical facts. This is a deterministic universe. And then you could ask participants in these studies, do you think that if the universe was like this, that people could be morally responsible for their actions? And people might be then asked to choose one of two responses, yes or no. If they say no, this could be interpreted as evidence that they favor an incompatibilist view. And if they say yes, this could be taken to be evidence that they endorse a compatibilist view of free will. So basically what philosophers do is they might set up either direct questions or thought experiments like this one, present these to people in a survey format, present them usually with a set of multiple choice response options, and then each one of those response options would be taken to be indicative of a person's philosophical position. So that's the standard way that those sorts of questions work. And so philosophers have been doing these for a while now. They post these surveys online, they give them to their students. And then what they do is they gather statistical information. So a lot of what they might gather is basically just descriptive data. So they might be able to tell you the proportion of people that endorse or favor a particular philosophical view, at least in the context of that study. But sometimes they conduct experiments and they do manipulations. So they might put people in different conditions and then see how that influences their philosophical judgments. When they do that, the data gets a lot more complicated.
Okay, so one small problem that I can think of is for the survey part is that most common people are not used to engage with philosophical questions about free will and all. So when we ask them questions in certain ways, right, they may answer in favor of compatibilism for one question. And when we frame the same question in a different manner, they may answer in favor of libertarianism. So how we tackle that issue?
It's a very tough issue to tackle. What I think is that what we really need to do is to figure out how people are interpreting the questions in the first place. So you're absolutely right that different framings of the questions result in different answers from people, and the compatibilist versus incompatibilist literature is a good example of this. There are quite a few studies on the topic, and they have very inconsistent results. This is frequently true of a lot of other studies in experimental philosophy, but it's not true of all of them. Some of the effects that we find seem to be fairly robust and reliable. There has been a study that looked at the replicability of studies in experimental philosophy, and they perform fairly well, at least as per that particular study. So the first thing to say is this is going to be case by case. Some stuff we're not going to have too much of an issue. People may interpret the questions well enough to give consistent responses, although they could be consistently not interpreting them as researchers intend, which would be a much more serious problem than a really inconsistent response because it's much harder to detect. In both cases, so in other words, what I'm saying is you could ask a group of people a question, they interpret that question, but not the way you wanted them to. So the results don't show what they're what you think they show. And then you give it to a second group of people, and they also interpret it in the unintended way that's the same as the first group. So you get a replicable result, but it's not really what you're trying to measure. It would be like if you use a bad thermometer to check the temperature. You go outside, it tells you a particular temperature, it's wrong. You go inside, you grab another thermometer, but it has the exact same defect. You go outside, you get the same temperature. Well, they're both defective in the same way. So now it looks like you've got two working thermometers, but actually you have two dysfunctional thermometers. So that replicable problem is a very serious problem. But when you do get the kind of variation you're talking about, or if you don't, in both cases, I think that the best way to address this is with qualitative research. What researchers need to do is to try to better understand how participants are interpreting the questions. And this is what I did in my own dissertation research in metaethics. What I did is I asked participants a variety of questions about the questions. And so in this respect, I was doing what you could call meta experimental philosophy. I was doing studies in order to study how we go about doing experimental philosophy. So what I did is I asked people questions like, I would give them the question used in another research and then say, why did you answer the question the way that you did? Or I would ask them, what do you think that this question is asking you? Or I would give them a written response that is the kind of response that would be consistent with what we're trying to measure with the question, and then say, what do you think this person's response means? Sometimes I would even ask them what they think the terms in the questions mean. So for instance, I would ask them what it means for morality to be objective, or what it means for morality to be relative. And in these cases, instead of having a forced choice, multiple choice question where they have to pick an A or a B or a C, where maybe they don't think any of those things, they wrote in their answers. Now it's a lot more work. I had to code all that work. It took a very long time and it was very, very, very challenging. But you code that and then you look at, well, how are they interpreting the questions? What I found, and this is a little alarming, is that the vast majority of the participants in my studies, and I sometimes gather data from other people's studies that also ask these open response qualitative questions about how people were interpreting the questions. I got other people's data and I analyzed that as well. In both cases, what I coded for is, did they interpret the question the way that researchers intended for them to interpret the question? Now, I should be clear. I say unintended interpretations, not misinterpretation. The reason for this is pretty straightforward. I think it would be inappropriate if a researcher is asking a confusing or bad question and a person doesn't understand the question and they give a response to say that they misinterpreted the question, because it implies that the participant is making some kind of mistake, that they're confused in a way that's like their fault. But I don't think that at all. I think that participants in these studies are basically given questions from philosophers where philosophers understand those questions in the appropriate philosophical contexts in which they're typically asked, because the philosophers have the training and background to understand, to resolve the ambiguities in a way where they know what they're being asked. But when you present these questions to people that are not in that context and don't have that training, they don't have that context. So it's not their fault that you're asking a question that the person just isn't in a position to be able to interpret as you're intending. The question is ambiguous and underspecified. In other words, it's both simultaneously, there might be 5 or 6 different possible interpretations, but the question is so vague, it's not even clear what those interpretations all are. So I'll just say the results were astonishing. Across almost every data set I had, I think it might be literally every one, there's a couple anomalous exceptions. The vast majority, or at least many, many, many people, did not interpret the questions in the way that researchers intended, or at least we couldn't establish that they did interpret them the way researchers did intend. In other words, we have kind of people that either clearly interpreted the question in some other way, or it's not clear whether they interpret it as intended, so we just don't know. And clear instances of intended interpretations were very rare for these studies. So it could be 2%, it could be 30, 40% across different studies, but it was typically quite low. Now, the thing is, people interpreting the questions you ask is not optional for the validity of the study. If the study is supposed to give you reliable data, you need the majority of your participants to understand what you're asking them in the way that you intend. And if they don't, your study doesn't show what you're using it to show. It doesn't rely on it. It's not a legitimate measure. It would be as bad as a thermometer that just doesn't tell you what the temperature is. So basically what we need is qualitative data on how people interpret questions. And we need that data to robustly show that when we present certain kinds of stimuli, whether in survey form or some other form, that the participants in the studies are, when they're engaged with or interacting with that stimuli, that they're responding to it in the way that is necessary for whatever response they give, whether it's an answer to a question or a behavior, that it's a result of what it is that the experimental philosophers are actually trying to measure or capture. And if we don't have that evidence, we're at least uncertain. And in some cases, we have evidence that they are not interpreting the questions as intended. And that's a really serious problem. So yeah, basically, we need qualitative research, and we really need to better understand the sort of the sort of meta psychological phenomena going on here. There is a serious barrier between asking people questions about philosophy and them interpreting them in the way that they would need to for our measures to really work. And we're not there yet for at least a lot of stuff. Free will and meta ethics being two examples.
Suppose we gather a quality data, like you already said that we can use this type of data to counter or address the empirical claims made by philosophers. But can we go further and make conclusion based on this data, like majority of people believe X, so X is true, that sort of reasoning?
Just from the qualitative data?
Yeah, from the qualitative data, can we make a conclusion like majority people believe X, therefore X is true?
I would be hesitant to draw those kinds of conclusions. The reason why, I mean, there's a reason and there's a good rationale for using quantitative data in the first place. And the reasoning behind that is that if you have a valid measure, what you want is for everybody to respond to the exact same stimuli. And then, that would be, you ask them all the same question and you give them options A, B, C. And, it's the reason why is that minimizes the potential for confounds to be introduced in basically different presentations across different participants. The different reactions could be due to the different ways the questions are phrased, or all sorts of stuff could be going on there. It also minimizes the degree to which the data that you're gathering is subject to researcher interpretation. So when I'm analyzing open response data, whether or not I judge that a participant interpreted a question as intended is due to my personal judgment. And if you're trying to gather statistical data on a population, what you want is data that speaks for itself. The moment you have the researcher themselves judging each response, whether it's an A or a B, you introduce a massive risk of researcher bias. So I am fully aware of the fact that I myself I'm not unaware of my own hypothesis. So I predicted that few people would interpret questions as intended. And what did I find? Few people interpreted questions as intended. Now, is that reliable? Maybe, but it could be that I myself am biased. So the whole point of the quantitative research is in part to minimize confounds and minimize the risk of researcher bias. And so therefore, I think any judgments based on qualitative data need to be very tentative, and we really couldn't make population level judgments. We're not going to be able to do like reasonable types of inferential statistics on very large populations using qualitative approaches. So although I think qualitative approaches have a role, and I think that they could be suggestive of certain types of, you could say, population level judgments, I wouldn't rely on them myself. In other words, I don't think qualitative data can replace quantitative data. I think that they need to work together.
Okay, what if it's both? Like if it's both qualitative and quantitative?
Basically, if you have converging lines of quantitative and qualitative data that are pointing in the same direction, that's ideal. I mean, because you could have a problem where the quantitative data says most people think A, and then the qualitative data says most people believe B. In that case, I wouldn't just trust the quantitative data just because quantitative data is often regarded as more rigorous. I wouldn't trust it because there are good reasons to think that there could be systematic unintended interpretations, especially in XFI or experimental philosophy, and especially because, at least in my case with meta-ethics, I think that I've shown pretty good evidence that there's something wrong with the way that the questions in the quantitative research are operationalized. In other words, the way that the questions are asked, I think cause systematic and reliable patterns of unintended interpretations. And so the studies may be replicable, and they may look like they're telling us something, but I don't think they're telling the whole story. Conversely, qualitative research could be extremely hard to interpret, and researcher bias is going to be a factor. I should say, I did have 2 other people also code subsets of my data, and my results, my coding tended to be quite similar to theirs, and they ended up being I was intermediate between the 2 of them. And they both tended to find very low rates, one a little bit higher than me and one a little bit lower than me. So one way of mitigating researcher bias is to have other researchers also code the data. I should also say, though, that those coders are both fairly sympathetic or fully sympathetic to the sorts of concerns that I have. And so you could just be repeating researcher bias. So one potential way of mitigating that would be to have an adversarial collaboration where someone that disagrees with my hypothesis codes the data. And if they come to the same conclusion, I think that bolsters the case that the qualitative data is informative. But really what you would want ideally is both qualitative data and quantitative data to point in the same direction. What we would want is converging and mutually corroborating lines of independent evidence in support of a claim. And qualitative and quantitative data working together can do that. Also, different qualitative approaches and quantitative approaches could work. So I used open response questions and surveys, but if an anthropologist conducted cultural anthropological search where they went around to different cultures or particular cultures and use the tools and methods of anthropologists, they might come to similar or different conclusions. And that could potentially corroborate or be inconsistent with the data that I have gathered. So that's another thing. There's different types of qualitative and quantitative data, and you might want to look at that. There's also, for instance, fMRI data. So you could look at neurophysiological data and see if that supports your thesis. So ideally what we want is multiple lines of evidence from different fields, approaches, and methods to see whether they are inconsistent, and that would prompt further investigation, or whether they converge, and that might sort of allow us to pinpoint. I don't think every question is going to be unanswerable, but I do think it's a lot more challenging than I think a lot of experimental philosophers think.
You already explained how the methodology works in regard to free will, but I also want to extend the same question towards consciousness and towards the theism vs atheism debate. So I'll start with the consciousness first. Because when regards to consciousness, most people intuitively believe that we have souls. So how is your view, with the help of experimental philosophy, can counter the other views? Before that, can you just say which view of consciousness you adopt to?
Sure. So I endorse a view called qualia quietism, and I'm also fairly sympathetic to a related view called meta-illusionism. Both of these views are articulated, and primarily quietism is defended in a paper by Pete Mandic. And that paper, so qualia quietism effectively is the view that certain terms and concepts in the academic philosophical literature on consciousness, primarily concepts referring to qualia or phenomenal states, that those terms are meaningless. They don't really capture or refer to anything that we could reasonably talk about. And so a lot of what is going on in the consciousness debates among academic philosophers involves the use of terms that there's nothing we could really say. They just don't refer to anything. They don't mean anything. And, in that paper, Mandic talks about this kind of terminological loop that you go in if you ask people what these terms mean. So you ask them what a phenomenal state is, and they'll say, well, it's what it's like to have an experience. You ask what that is, and you'll be given some kind of metaphor or something, and you'll just kind of go in this endless loop of mutually interdefining terms that Mandic argues form a vicious circle. It's just a circular set of interdefining terms that they're not adequately integrated with the rest of our terms. So it's just not clear that they're referring to anything. So that might sound a little weird, but basically what I'm saying is that I do not endorse that there is any such thing as phenomenal consciousness or qualia. I don't think that there are such things, but I also don't even think that there are qualia is false. I think it's literally meaningless. I don't think it means anything. So basically what I think is that a lot of philosophical views on the nature of consciousness, including, these are possibly the most popular views, are conceptual and linguistic errors. They're confusions that result from the bad methods that philosophers employ. Meta-illusionism is an accompanying view which holds that philosophers who are illusionists, philosophers that deny that. So basically, illusionism is a pair of views. It's that, very simply, this is people think they have qualia, but they don't, and that's the illusion. The illusion is that there's this qualitative aspect to experience, but there isn't such a thing. So what Mandic argues is that it may be that people don't even think that they have qualia. They're not subject to that illusion. And so it's not just that there are no qualia, it's that it doesn't even seem to people in general that there are qualia. Now, there's ways of threading that needle. I think that there's another aspect of illusionism, which is that people are subject to a kind of user illusion where their phenomenology, like, all of their different sensory experiences seem to be interwoven into a single ongoing narrative in which all sort of sensory inputs are experienced simultaneously, and that it has a certain sort of richness to it. So you're touching, smelling, hearing, seeing everything all at once at the same time, and in particular sorts of ways, and that's not true. So I do think a degree of illusionism is preserved, in which basically people think they have a user illusion, but they're mistaken about that. But I'm a quietist and I'm a meta illusionist in the sense that if anybody claims people think they have qualia, but they don't, I don't endorse that. I think only philosophers and some people influenced by philosophy think that they have qualia or phenomenal states, and I think they're mistaken about that. Okay, sorry, that was a bit complicated. So basically, my view is very similar to the illusionist views endorsed by Dan Dennett and Keith Frankish.
I just have a quick question about a comment made by Castro. He said that the illusionism is a shit show in philosophy. So it's a shit show in philosophy. So this guy is an idealist.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I don't have enough context to know. I mean, that sounds like he doesn't like illusionism very much.
Most philosophers, they have a very strong intuition that qualia exists. So this is kind of conflicting with your view and with illusionism.
Yeah, a lot of philosophers do not like illusionism. They will call it like the stupidest and most ridiculous view ever. They will say scornful and contemptuous things about Dan Dennett and Keith Frankish. They are routinely subject to scorn, ridicule, mockery, insults, dismissiveness, laughter. This is not a position that enjoys a lot of love. It's not a view that no philosophers endorse. There's probably plenty of philosophers that endorse illusionism or something similar to it, or other types of views that are skeptical about qualia or phenomenal states. I use the terms interchangeably. But yeah, a lot of people have a very, very negative attitude towards it. So it wouldn't surprise. I'm sure many, many other philosophers do so as well. I routinely see comments about from even professional philosophers, but also just non-philosophers. They're just really critical and disparaging towards illusionist views and views adjacent to it, like my own. I don't take that. I don't take that to be a good indication that illusionism is wrong. I think if they had good objections to it, that they would present those. And the fact that they don't, and they rely on insults and mockery, is an indication that they really don't have much to go on as far as their objections to it. In other words, if someone had a good argument against it, they could just present that. And instead, it's a lot of scoffing and it's like, oh my gosh, it's so silly. And okay, well, why? Why is it so silly? And if it's just a bunch of incredulity and just scoffing, what am I supposed to do with that? I don't think that has any argumentative force. So yeah, I think what I would also say is that a lot of these reactions are so nasty and unpleasant that it's kind of shocking how immature some of these critics are. It's honestly kind of pathetic. It's kind of pathetic that from my perspective, they don't have good objections, so they just act like jerks. So to me, that's an indication that maybe a small indication that illusionism is on the right track. And I would just say generally, philosophers have a terrible track record on these sorts of things. And illusionism, I think, is exactly the kind of approach, that Dennett and Frankish take that is well integrated with contemporary cognitive science and an understanding of how human brains actually work. So an approach that emphasizes the empirical side of things, I think, is more likely to win out. And illusionism in particular, I think, will be vindicated in the future. So I think history will look back on the scornful attitude from philosophers as a very embarrassing episode in their history. So yeah, I'm not personally troubled by it. I think it's kind of amusing.
So I also think the part of problem is the heavy reliance on prior philosophy. Like we don't need any type of science, any type of cognitive science or psychology or neuroscience in philosophy. Philosophy must be isolated from all these other sort of disciplines. Maybe this type of attitude must be the reason why most philosophers tend to get away from illusionism, don't you think?
Yeah, so a lot of philosophers will say that they're naturalists, or they will say things you sort of on paper, like they're amenable or welcoming of the sciences. But I think in practice, you have both the more rationalistically oriented philosophers and the quote unquote naturalist philosophers that would say that they're empiricists, that I think are still so wedded to this vision of analytic philosophy as being this autonomous discipline that the sciences may never encroach upon. That I think that the field is backing itself into a methodological corner by avoiding integration with the sciences. I think integration with the sciences would dissolve or resolve many longstanding philosophical disputes. But this is a point I've been stressing for a while now, and I wrote a recent blog post about this, titled "Philosophy Isn't About Philosophy." I think a lot of these philosophers, they are they're inducted into this system, the analytic philosophy and Western philosophy more generally, that's been going on for well over 2,000 years. We could date things back to the pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. And for many of them, I think that these intractable puzzles, they want them to remain puzzles because they want to keep playing the game. I think a lot of philosophers pursue philosophy for recreational purposes and because they enjoy the process of philosophy itself, not because they want to actually settle things and get things resolved. I think if they really did, and if philosophy was actually about truth, that there wouldn't be as much surreptitious scorn and dismissiveness towards the role that the empirical sciences can play in addressing traditionally philosophical issues. Philosophers, I think, are in many cases, if not deathly afraid, then at least deeply anxious about lifting the hood and uncovering how human psychology works. Before I was talking about understanding the psychology of intuitions. What if, when we do that psychological research, it reveals that what philosophers are doing is so muddled that it's hard to even say that they're doing things wrong. It's just that what they're doing is literally nonsensical. That's what I suspect we would find. I think that philosophers are in for a very rude awakening because these psychological sciences, including the sciences that are relevant to consciousness, will continue and are going on outside of academic philosophy. And philosophers can get on board or they could be left behind. And it looks to me like most of contemporary analytic philosophy has decided to go with a get left behind strategy. It is a losing strategy. It might make them feel safe and protected now, but what will happen is they will become increasingly insular, increasingly irrelevant, increasingly disconnected from the ability to provide genuine insights about what the world is like, including things relevant to practical everyday human life, but to the world in general. And the discipline will look increasingly like theology. And I think that process is already underway. And I think that the empirical philosophers are sort of heroically holding the line and at least contributing something valuable to philosophy. But I think so much other philosophy is, for a long time I was afraid to just say things bluntly, but I'll put it bluntly. I think that a substantial proportion, possibly the vast majority of contemporary analytic philosophy is completely worthless. It might even be worse than worthless. It might actually be detrimental because it's standing in the way of making genuine philosophical progress by sort of filling up the niche in which these sorts of questions could be productively answered were we to use better philosophical and, as the case may be, non-philosophical and empirical methods. Really, I should say, I think empirical methods are philosophical methods. I see the two as continuous. But as long as the anti-empirical or non-empirical philosophers dominate the field, I think that they are standing in the way of kinds of methodologies to doing philosophy that I think actually can resolve things. So the kind of approach that Dennett takes, I think, is an incredibly useful approach, one that is informed by like what the research tells us about human minds and how they work, and animal minds too, and how they work, and how artificial intelligence works. So philosophers can feel free to ignore that. They ignore it at their own peril, and the future irrelevance of the discipline.
I'll get to the next part of my question, which is about the theism vs atheism debate. How experimental philosophy can contribute to this debate. Before that, I also want to give out a common argument presented by the theist, which is that most people believe in God. We have collected data of children's, they believe in God. So they have a kind of agent-seeking tendency, which they say is can be used to justify theism.
Yeah, so it could be that I find it really plausible that people may have some degree of an evolved predisposition, if not to believe in God, then to at least be able to conceptually, or I guess, yeah, like conceptualize minds apart from bodies, and that is something that people all over the world could reliably do in a bunch of different populations. And I think that may pave the way or render it easier for people to think of disembodied minds, and that could allow them to imagine God. So I do think that the capacity for doing that, to the extent that we have it and there's evidence to support it, could plausibly be attributed to our evolutionary history, although it may have been adapted for serving other purposes than religion. I don't really know what the present data on the degree to which a disposition for distinctively religious type beliefs, like beliefs in sort of supernatural things, like intermediary disembodied minds that influence the world or accept requests or are interactive with people. I don't know about the degree to which that's shaped by evolution. What I would say though is that research on those sorts of questions, for whatever reason, I think wouldn't typically be a part of experimental philosophy. And part of the reason for that is that psychology of religion has been around for a while, and researchers in a variety of psychological fields have already been studying that without any distinctively like philosophical, like they're not part of experimental philosophy as a sort of tradition. They might not have backgrounds in philosophy. They wouldn't think of themselves as experimental philosophers. So I would say that that's part of psychology more broadly, and not experimental philosophy in particular. If experimental philosophers were to address these questions, it's likely that they would address them by looking at questions that do typically fall within the scope of philosophy. So, for instance, I could see philosophers, and maybe they've already done this. In fact, I would expect that they have present non-philosophers with the Euthyphro dilemma or other sorts of classic theistic or religious questions that are specifically and sort of distinctively or iconically addressed in philosophy. I could see them presenting people with those sorts of questions, and that falling within the scope of experimental philosophy. But a lot of the studies are going to fall outside of experimental philosophy. As far as what XFi can do to inform that, that's at least a case where I don't think it's going to face as serious of a challenge as free will and meta-ethics, where I do think people have a good sense of what we're talking about when we talk about gods. So at least I think that that's a tractable set of questions that experimental philosophy could contribute to. Exactly how, I'm not really sure. It's not really an area I study.
Okay, so whenever I have discussion with theists, like they give two line of reasoning. One is using intuition. They say they have an intuition that God exists, therefore they are justified in believing it. So that is one sort of reasoning. The other sort of reasoning is majority of the people in the world believe that the God exists. So it is the human nature to believe it. So we can conclude that God exists.
Yeah, you had been asking me. So they'll make this claim: "Hey, most people believe in God," and this appears to be this sort of reliably emerges early in life tendency to believe in gods or whatever. That's taken to be evidence that God exists. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Right. Yeah, I would say personally, I'm totally comfortable with saying that provides some evidence that God exists. If people have, a tendency to believe something is true, I do take it as some evidence that it's true. And furthermore, if it seems to people that it's true, I don't have a problem with saying that provides some distinctive type of evidence. So because it does appear that most people believe in God. There is the question of how and why most people believe in God. So are most people taught to believe in God? Are they naturally disposed to believe in God? I suspect the answer in this case is going to be that it's kind of a combination, that people are sort of primed or readily disposed to believe in gods, and then cultures provide, and they say, yeah, there are gods, so believe in them. This is going to be the same as I would say in the other cases. what we need to do is understand the psychological mechanisms involved in people's tendency to believe in God and see whether that we think that the way that those systems function are reliable truth tracking systems. My guess is that they wouldn't be. And so once we know enough about human psychology, we would see that the mere fact that people are inclined to believe in God is not particularly good evidence that God exists. But the fact that people believe in God, all else being equal, I do take to be some degree of evidence. And the more people, the more the evidence is. I just don't take it to be dispositive. Like, it doesn't settle the matter. So yeah, most people think gods exist. Sure, I'm fine with saying that's a little bit of evidence, but it's not enough to push me towards believing in God.
Yeah, but part of the experimental philosophy is not just taking survey on people, but also getting to know how they form the belief, like what sort of faculties we get reliable intuitions. So there are areas where humans are pretty much reliable, and there are areas which we are not. So metaphysics is an area where humans mostly get wrong answers using intuition. So experimental philosophy, will it give any insight to why or why not we should trust the survey?
Yeah, so I'm just not familiar enough with the current data in experimental philosophy to know how much it contributes to addressing those questions. I just don't know the answer. What I would say though is that I think it can. This is a case where I don't think so. A lot of my own work in experimental philosophy, I argue that people like non-philosophers just don't have philosophical views at all about certain kinds of topics, and it's probably very controversial, but I don't think non-philosophers are moral realists or anti-realists. I endorse what I call meta-ethical, like folk meta-ethical indeterminacy. I think they're neither. I think the same thing about free will, which may be surprising to people. I think free will is a philosophical term of art. I think it's a culturally specific idea, and I don't think that it's present in the way that non-philosophers think. However, I do think belief in God is a part of the way that non-philosophers think. And so I do think that it's plausible and not terribly insurmountable to where I'm a total pessimist about it for us to conduct studies on that sort of question and address it. I don't personally study it, but it seems tractable to me, at least as tractable as psychological questions in general go. I mean, psychology is unbelievably difficult, and this is the sort of issue, belief in God, where there are so many cultural factors involved that it's super challenging. It's the kind of question that we need large scale, massive integrative efforts on a global scale to study how people think about God in cultures all over the world. And it can't just be weird cultures and then like two other places. It's got to be really, really, really good cross cultural research. And sure, I think we're likely to get insights out of that. I just don't personally know a whole lot about them, at least not offhand.
Thank you very much for the interview. We get a lot of insights from you. So for the audience, please check out his channel. It's called Lambs Independent. You get a lot of discussion about moral anti-realism. He is one of the reason why I got into anti-realism. Like, I was supporting moral realism 6 months before. Yeah. Then my views slowly changed. So you are a part of reason why my views changed. Okay, so
That's awesome.
I do recommend, yeah. So I do recommend his channel. You and Kane B, and there's a couple of others. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much.